When Sony held their Road to PS5 conference all the way back in March, lead system architect at PlayStation, Mark Cerny, laid bare many of the PS5's core capabilities. But while we did get specs, we also got a lot of tech jargon. Thankfully, June's PS5 showcase was way more consumer-friendly, but having focused so much on games, it still left many hardware-related questions unanswered. What sort of graphical improvements can we expect? Will the PS5's SSD do more than just eliminate load times? And just how backwards compatible is the PS5 going to be? After doing a ton of research, these are just some of the questions I set out to answer in this video. And while I will use some technical language, I'm going to do my best to explain the most exciting benefits of the PS5 in terms that anybody can understand. In other words, rather than just spew out stats and numbers, I'm going to explain how and why those stats and numbers are going to change your experience of playing a video game. Before we begin, I do have a couple of disclaimers. First, many of the benefits I'll explain are featured on both the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, but this is not a dedicated comparison video. I do talk about the Series X, but only when it's relevant or when comparing features will help you determine what sort of value the PS5 brings to the table. Second, while I am a PlayStation gamer at heart, I truly hope that both the PS5 and Series X release to amazing success. And with that, I hope you'll join me as I take a close look at the hardware and the features of the PlayStation 5. This video was brought to you by NordVPN. To get 70% off a 3-year plan plus 1 month free, stick around till the end of the video or click the link in the description below. But for now, let's get into it. While the vast majority of this video will focus on the PS5's internal hardware, I do want to first look at the box itself. As we know, Sony is releasing 2 models, the Standard Edition, which features a 4K UHD Blu-ray drive, and the Digital Edition, which won't use any physical media. In a June 12th interview with CNET, President and CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment, Jim Ryan, did say that other than the disk drive, the 2 models are, quote, identical products. So, in terms of storage and performance, the 2 consoles will be equal. Of course, their different form factors are easy to notice, but one aspect of the PS5's exterior that's easy to overlook is its massive size. Based on the standard length of a Blu-ray disc slot, fans quickly deduced that the console will stand 15.74 inches tall. To put that in perspective, the PS4 Pro stands 12.9 inches tall, and the Xbox Series X, while significantly wider, is just 11.85 inches tall. As for how you'll fit that into your entertainment center, you can obviously stand it upright, but you can also lay it horizontally if that's your style. When it comes to ports, we know that both versions will feature a USB-A and USB-C port, with a USB-C port being used to charge the controller. We haven't seen the back of the console, so we don't know if it will have anything beyond the standard power and HDMI ports. Lastly, on the Standard Edition, we can see what appears to be a power and an eject button, while the Digital Edition shows just a power button. Okay, now that we've covered the box, let's talk about what the PlayStation 5 can actually do. As many gamers expected, Sony has confirmed that the PS5 will be backwards compatible with PlayStation 4 games. That said, this won't necessarily include the entire PS4 library. Instead, each PS4 game will have to be tested by developers to determine whether it's suitable to play on the PS5, which leaves open the possibility that some games might not work. However, Sony did say in a recent post on the PlayStation blog that, quote, "We believe that the overwhelming majority of the 4,000 plus PS4 titles will be playable on PS5. Sony also said that these titles would benefit from certain technical enhancements. Quote, "We're expecting backward-compatible titles will run at a boosted frequency on PS5 so they can benefit from higher or more stable frame rates and potentially higher resolutions." Also, this will include both physical and digital games, but make sure you buy the standard edition PS5 if you've got a collection of physical PS4 discs that you'll still want to play. We also know that the PS5 will be backwards compatible with PlayStation VR. Moving forward, we recently learned in a Eurogamer article that any PS4 games submitted by its developers for certification after July 13th, 2020 must be fully compatible with PlayStation 5. Keep in mind that only includes games submitted for certification after July 13th, not games released after July 13th. And while again this is not a comparison video, I do think it's worth noting that backwards compatibility is one feature that's better on Xbox Series X. While the vast majority of PS4 games will work on the PS5, Microsoft has confirmed that the Series X will not only play thousands of Xbox One games, it will also play those games for the original Xbox and Xbox 360 that are already backwards compatible. Plus, these games will work with a slew of impressive technical improvements not yet announced for the PS5. And while Sony has neglected to announce any plans to make PS1, PS2, or PS3 games playable on the PlayStation 5, it's worth mentioning that they did recently file a patent that would enable games from all three generations to be emulated and playable from the cloud. Whether this would be an entirely new ecosystem or whether it would piggyback off of PlayStation Now, I'm not entirely sure, but it does indicate that Sony is considering expanding the PS5's capabilities when it comes to backwards compatibility. But playing old games is just one part of the compatibility puzzle. What about current games that release on both the PS4 and the PS5? Well, let's take a look. One thing that's getting a lot of attention this generation is the idea of cross-generational support. What I mean by that is, for some games that release on both the PS4 and PS5, you'll be able to upgrade to the PS5 version of those games for free, given that you purchase the PS4 version. Confused? You're not alone, but it might help if I explain how Xbox is handling the same benefit. At the launch of the Xbox Series X, all Series X and Xbox One consoles will incorporate a feature called Smart Delivery. Games that take advantage of Smart Delivery will let you buy a last-gen version of a game and upgrade to the next-gen version without making any additional purchase. Just insert the last-gen disc into your next-gen console and it will automatically download the version of the game that's been specifically developed for next-gen. In the past, this just wasn't possible. Take Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, which released on both the PS3 and the PS4. But you had to decide which version to buy, and that was the version you were stuck with unless you wanted to buy it twice. With games that take advantage of Smart Delivery, you'll no longer have to make that decision, at least on Xbox Series X. So, what about the PS5? Well, the downside is that Sony has not announced a similar unified feature. But the good news is that some publishers have announced that specific games will allow players to upgrade from the PS4 version to PS5 for free. Among those are Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Watch Dogs Legion, Cyberpunk 2077, and Marvel's Avengers. Should you buy these games on PS4, you'll be able to upgrade for free when they eventually release on PS5. That said, it's not so simple for every game. Ubisoft recently announced that if you want to upgrade from a physical disc to the digital version of any of their games, you'll still need to own the standard edition PS5 as opposed to the digital edition console. Electronic Arts announced that you'll be able to upgrade Madden NFL 21 and FIFA 21, but in order to do so, you'll have to purchase those games before the release of Madden NFL 22 or FIFA 22, respectively. Okay, that's not so bad. But then there's Take-Two Interactive, announcing recently that if you want to upgrade NBA 2K21, you'll have to purchase the special edition on PS4 for a whopping $99.99, and that's for both PlayStation and Xbox. It appears these upgrades, especially on PlayStation 5, will work differently on a game-by-game basis. But again, the big takeaway here is that while Sony has not announced a platform-wide feature to support free upgrades, and that is a bummer, it appears that publishers can offer upgrade programs of their own. So let's recap. We know that the PS5 will play the vast majority of PS4 games, and we know that you'll be able to upgrade to the PS5 version of some current games for free. but there's even more to the compatibility story. We also know that PS5 games won't be playable on PS4. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, isn't that just how new consoles work? Well, not for the Xbox Series X, which according to Microsoft won't have any truly exclusive games for at least 1 year. That's because all games released for the Series X, even first-party heavy hitters like Halo Infinite, will also be playable on the Xbox One. So, if you want games that are truly exclusive to your shiny new console, well, the PS5 is the only choice, at least at launch. The most notable of these games are Sony's first-party exclusives, like Spider-Man Miles Morales, which is a launch title, as well as Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart and Horizon 2 Forbidden West, which don't yet have release dates. Okay, now that we've talked a bit about which games you'll be able to play on PS5, it's time to talk about the actual hardware. And fair warning, this is where I'm going to get somewhat technical, but only insofar as it helps understand how and why playing games on the PS5 is going to be different than playing games on the previous generation. The hardware feature of the PS5 that's received by far the most attention is the custom solid-state drive, or SSD, that's replacing the conventional hard drive of the PlayStation 4. Now, the SSD is only 825 gigabytes, which isn't much, and I'll get to that, but for now I want to focus on how it's going to change your video gaming experience and even how video games are made. If we want to fully understand this, we need to first look, at least broadly, at what the SSD does. At a high level, an SSD does the same thing as a traditional hard drive. It stores data, in this case entire video games, then retrieves that data in large chunks, which it sends or loads to the console's memory, or RAM. It's then from RAM, not the SSD, that data is either displayed on your TV, played on your speakers, or interacted with via your controller. And it's that process of loading game data from the SSD to RAM that's now going to happen so much faster. That's because while traditional hard drives are mechanical, that is to say they use literal moving parts, SSDs have no moving parts. They store data on flash memory and as a result can operate more or less instantaneously. To draw a comparison, the PS4's hard drive has a bandwidth of between 50 and 100 megabytes of data per second. On the other hand, the PS5's SSD can move over 5 gigabytes of data per second. That's really fast, even for next-gen consoles. The SSD within the Xbox Series X has a bandwidth of 2.4 gigabytes per second. Still fast, but less than half of the PS5. But the question remains, how does a lightning-fast SSD change the experience of playing a video game? Let's first look at load times. Based on the time it takes for the PS4's hard drive to locate data and its max bandwidth of 100 megabytes per second, the PS4 can load about 1 gigabyte in 20 seconds. According to Sony, the PS5 will load twice that amount of data, 2 gigabytes, in a mere 0.27 seconds. To put it another way, let's say a game takes 1 full second to fade to black after you die. In that amount of time, your PS5 can load over 6 gigabytes of data, more than enough to reload a level. As you can imagine, this will virtually eliminate load times not just after you die, but also when a game boots up, when a level initially loads, and when you fast travel between areas. It'll be really fun to compare load times on games that are launching across generations such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Cyberpunk 2077. But of course, the lack of load times will be noticeable no matter what game you're playing. In Spider-Man Miles Morales, you'll no longer have to kill time on the subway, and if you're planning on grabbing Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, you can expect to jump instantly from one level to another. While faster load times are great, they're not the only benefit or even the most exciting benefit of the PS5's solid-state drive. It might sound lofty, but integrating SSDs into consoles will actually enable developers to build worlds that simply weren't possible on previous generations. You know those tight corridors you've had to squeeze through or long elevator rides you've had to sit through before advancing to a new area of a game? Those exist not because developers want them there, but because current console limitations require levels to be broken into smaller chunks of data. Think of it this way. A console system memory, or again the RAM, is limited. In the case of the PS4, it's 8 gigabytes, and in the PS5, it's 16 gigabytes. But in both cases, that's often not big enough to hold all the data needed to run an entire level at once. That's why games need to be loaded in chunks. What's happening during those corridors and elevator rides is the RAM is ditching the assets of the previous area and loading the assets of the new area. With the PS5's SSD, the entire process can now happen fast enough to do away with these interstitial, time-killing animations. The implication here is that developers should no longer have to force-fit these sections into levels, and more importantly, they'll have more freedom as they build their games. But you might be saying, not all games have corridors and elevators. Well, there are other tricks designers use to avoid load times, but they also greatly limit level design as a whole. Cerny illustrated this during his presentation by showing this area from Jak 2. And yes, Jak 2 is 20 years old, but according to Cerny and other developers I've heard comment on the topic, this example is still relevant to how games are made today. See how windy the level is? How many corners it has? The purpose of such a design, at least in part, is to limit a player's line of sight, ensuring that the game only has to load assets that a player might be able to see, hear, or literally run to within a given amount of time. In other words, a game can only load so much data at once, so developers restrict what the player can see and where they can go. But what if this didn't have to be the case? Well, with the PS5, it shouldn't be, at least not to the degree that it has been. That's because rather than loading huge chunks of data at once, which takes time, the PlayStation 5's SSD is fast enough to stream individual assets to your TV screen the instant you encounter them. In the time it takes you to literally turn around within a game, the assets that were behind you can make their way from the SSD to your TV. Now, I'm no developer, but based on Cerny's presentation, here's what I was able to infer in terms of how this will result in new and different worlds. Say a level designer is building two separate, data-heavy environments within the same level. On prior consoles, those two areas might need to be completely separated, maybe by a long windy path or a physical obstacle that once overcome, you can't turn back. But now, at least as I understand things, those two environments can coexist in the same area, so long as they're separated by the very brief amount of time and space it takes to ditch one and load the other. Surely there are nuances to level design that I can't address here, but even if I am oversimplifying things, it's clear that the SSD in the PS5 will enable creators to build worlds that are more true to their imaginative vision. Sure, they can still integrate windy sections into their levels, but now they can do it because it adds to the experience, not because it's a restrictive technical requirement. Just to drive this point home, consider this quote from Neil Druckmann, Vice President of Naughty Dog, referring to his experience working on The Last of Us Part 2. Quote, "There's so much work that happens behind the scenes of how we design levels, how we chop them up, and it's all invisible to the player. You never see any of that work. But now, knowing that we're going to be able to load things more quickly, it just means the designers don't have to be as constrained by how they lay things out, how they think about things when they load new characters, so I'm excited to see the doors that open for us." Coming from Druckmann, someone who just directed one of the most technically impressive games of all time, I can't stress how big of a deal this actually is. When talented studios like Naughty Dog hit their stride on PS5, we'll hopefully see worlds and levels that had never been possible before. And with this ability to now stream rather than load huge segments of data, the benefits of the SSD stretch even farther. Say you load all the assets of a single level onto system memory, and those assets take up 4 gigabytes. Sure, with an SSD you can now do that in less than a second, but in doing so you've just occupied 4 gigabytes of system memory. Furthermore, many of those assets might only be used for a fraction of a second, or not at all if, for example, you don't go to an optional part of a level. That's 4 gigabytes that could otherwise be used, as Cerny put it, on behalf of the game itself. On PS5, you can now stream those assets from the SSD as they're needed, rather than include them in one huge chunk of largely idle data that just gets parked in memory. This frees all that space in RAM to load even larger areas, display more data-heavy assets including 4K textures, or perform other tasks. Another boost that will result from the SSD is that you'll now be able to literally move through worlds faster than ever before. Consider Spider-Man. Cerny said in his Wired interview in 2019 that on PS4, the speed at which Spider-Man swings his way through New York City is limited by the speed at which the hard drive can load data. But the PS5's SSD can keep up with players moving at much higher speeds. I imagine this will allow for certain gameplay scenes that just weren't possible on the PS4, especially in games where you fly or where the camera itself needs to move really fast independent of the player. I'm just spitballing here, but imagine if fast travel involved the camera literally zooming through the game's world from one location to another in a matter of seconds. One final note about the performance of the SSD is that it should work more efficiently than a PC SSD with similar specs. That's because unlike a PC, every component of the PS5 was custom built to work specifically with every other component. That's impressive given that the specs of this SSD are already on par with other industry-leading drives. One benefit of the SSD that's not performance-related is that it will allow for bigger games, and by that I mean developers will literally be able to fit more data on a Blu-ray disc or within the file that you download from the PlayStation Store. One major reason for this is that the limited speed of the PS4's hard drive meant that certain visual assets within a game had to be duplicated on a disc over and over again. To explain this, Sony once again used Spider-Man as an example. You know all those mailboxes scattered across New York City? Those were duplicated over 400 times. This is again because the PS4's hard drive forced developers to split their game into chunks, in this case, city blocks. Using this graphic here, Sony explained that each city block had to include not just one mailbox, but each instance of that mailbox. I imagine this also goes for newsstands, pedestrians, and other repeatable assets. But now the PS5's SSD can just load that mailbox right before you encounter it from one instance off of the SSD. As you can imagine, this will free up tons of space for other data such as high-resolution assets, and speaking of freeing up space, that brings me to the next benefit of the PS5 that I want to explore. One thing I briefly touched on is that the SSD within the PS5 is only going to provide 825 gigabytes of storage. That's not much considering that AAA games nowadays can require more than 100 gigabytes. And for comparison's sake, the SSD in the Series X offers 1 full terabyte of storage. Thankfully, there are a number of ways to expand the storage in your PS5. First, you can purchase a traditional external hard drive, which will store and play PS4 games without taking up valuable space on the SSD. And while you won't be able to play PS5 games directly from a hard drive, you will be able to store PS5 games that you've set aside so you won't have to re-download them should you decide to reinstall and play them later. So, what if you want to expand your SSD storage and play your PS5 games from that? Well, you will be able to buy and install an internal M.2 NVMe SSD. These will fit into a custom bay built into the PS5, so you'll have to buy one that fits, plus it will also have to meet Sony's required performance specifications. Sony has said they'll provide a list of approved SSDs, but unfortunately this list probably won't be released until sometime after the PS5's launch. If you don't want to expand your storage, or it's just too expensive, Sony is thankfully taking measures to ensure you don't fill up the entire 825 gigabytes quite so quickly. In Wired Magazine's article from last year, it was teased that the PS5 might be able to install and uninstall only portions of a game, rather than the whole thing. So for example, when you finish a single-player campaign, you might be able to uninstall only that part of the game, leaving the more evergreen multiplayer content available to play. Now, some of you might be asking, why haven't I yet talked about the PS5's custom GPU? Well, I actually have. Backwards compatibility is a feature built into the GPU, but as you can imagine, it does a lot of other stuff too. Let's take a look. First off, let's address the teraflops in the room. We've all seen that the PS5's GPU achieves 10.3 teraflops, as opposed to the PS4 Pro's 4.2 teraflops. But as I've discovered in my research, and as put quite simply by Digital Foundry's Richard Leadbeater, quote, teraflops are not a great indicator of a machine's performance, end quote. That's because, in short, every GPU, console, and computer is different. For example, in the PS5's GPU, the individual compute units are packed with 62% more transistors than those in the PS4. And as you may know, increased transistor count is tied to increased performance. Plus, the PS5's GPU runs at a whopping 2.23 GHz. That's more than twice the frequency of the PS4 Pro. Given these additional multiples, one PS5 teraflop is way more powerful than one PS4 teraflop. Also, it's not accurate to directly compare a PS5 teraflop to an Xbox Series X teraflop because the two consoles are built entirely differently. That said, the Series X GPU achieves 12 teraflops, but it runs at a slower 1.825 GHz. Despite their differences, both consoles are set to be drastic improvements over the previous generation. Of course, the question remains, what can the PS5's GPU actually do? Well, here are some of the highlights. It will support 4K resolution at up to 120 frames per second if your TV supports it. It will also support 8K gaming, but don't expect many or even any games to take advantage of this anytime soon. In fact, while I do expect 4K to be a standard offering for most, if not all, big-budget games at launch, I don't expect frame rates as high as 120 or even 60 frames per second to be standard anytime soon. It's up to developers to achieve these benchmarks, but with game worlds always pushing the envelope, I wouldn't be surprised if some or even many games still run at 30 frames per second, at least as developers get used to next-gen hardware. Moving on, the GPU also supports ray tracing and other visual effects, which I'll get to soon, and it can run games built on Unreal Engine 5, which I'll also get to a bit later. Okay, let's look at ray tracing. In short, ray tracing is the ability to simulate in real time how individual rays of light and sound will realistically bounce around within a game's world to create more lifelike images and experiences. We saw what this could look like in the future when Epic Games showed off their demo for Unreal Engine 5. Microsoft has also shown off what ray tracing can do within Minecraft, and it's definitely worth a look. Now, this is the same technology Hollywood has used for some time to create lifelike CG, but those images are all pre-rendered. In-game ray tracing often requires the real-time simulation of hundreds of millions of rays per second, which takes some serious muscle. While the PS5 will support ray tracing, that's not to say it will be featured in every game. Mark Cerny calls the ray tracing instructions on PS5 as, quote, pretty memory intensive, and as such, it's totally optional for developers. There are also different degrees to which developers can integrate ray tracing into their games. For audio ray tracing, the PS5 will have to process less than 1 million rays per second. Ray-traced shadows and reflections, however, could require the PS5 to process hundreds of millions of rays per second, while full-on ray tracing could take billions. So, how much can the PS5 handle? Cerny answered this directly, quote, how far can we go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using ray tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with only modest costs, end quote. Cerny was possibly referring to Ratchet & Clank, which has been confirmed to feature ray-traced reflections. The next feature of the GPU that Cerny talked about during his Road to PS5 presentation is what's called the Geometry Engine. At the risk of being reductive, it sounds like the Geometry Engine lets developers do more with the in-game geometry, that is to say the triangles that make up the game's graphics, both on and off the screen. Most notably, developers can now use specific tools called primitive shaders, which Cerny said allow developers to smoothly vary a game's graphical level of detail, add additional procedural details to close-up objects, and improve particle effects. I think it's important to mention here that while the PS5's graphics will be better than the PS4's, without a doubt, we might not see the generational leap in graphics that we've come to expect with new generations until we're well into the PlayStation 5's lifecycle. Just look at the graphics we saw in the Unreal Engine 5 demo. Epic promised that Unreal Engine 5 will make it easier for developers to create beautiful and realistic global illumination effects, that's where ray tracing comes in, and use film quality assets all in real time. This demo ran in real time on a PlayStation 5, and if games built on Unreal Engine 5 end up looking this good, then we have a lot to look forward to. But the engine won't be ready until 2021. So, if you haven't been impressed by the graphics seen on the PS5, or for that matter the Xbox Series X, worry not. It looks like, again, that huge generational leap is coming. And of course, there are Sony's first-party studios like Naughty Dog and Guerrilla that work with proprietary engines, and we'll likely see some really impressive stuff from them as well. The PS5 features an AMD Zen 2-based CPU with 8 cores. But to understand what that means, we need to talk about how it works together with the PS5's GPU to squeeze out every ounce of performance. This happens in a number of ways, but the one I want to focus on involves one of the biggest overall differences between the PS4 and the PS5. Fair warning, I'm going to get pretty technical once again, but my hope is to make this section more consumer-friendly than most other descriptions I've read or heard online. Okay, the big change here from the PS4 to PS5 is that the PS5 now allows for the CPU and GPU to run at what are called variable frequencies, or if you prefer, variable speeds. But what does this mean? Well, both processors will run for the vast majority of time at boosted speeds. Speeds so high, they'll occasionally need to adjust or vary in order to keep the PS5 from exceeding its set power budget. In other words, and this might seem counterintuitive, but the CPU and GPU will be working so hard they'll need to minimally downclock when you encounter part of a game that would have otherwise caused the system to, say, overheat or get really noisy. With this system in place, the PS5 CPU will run for most of the time at 3.5 GHz, while the GPU will run at 2.23 GHz. Again, for comparison's sake, the Xbox Series X GPU will run slightly slower than the PS5's, while its CPU will run slightly faster than the PS5's. But bear in mind, this isn't apples to apples because, among other reasons, the Series X does not use a variable frequency approach. All numbers and technical jargon aside, what you really need to know is that the PS5 will achieve levels of performance that were otherwise unobtainable at temperatures that are safe and hopefully at noise levels that are far more tolerable than the jet engine that Sony somehow crammed into the PS4. As for gameplay benefits, Sony hasn't gotten very specific, but what Cerny said on the matter was this, quote, "The change to a variable frequency approach will show significant gains for PlayStation gamers," end quote. Again, I wish he'd been more specific, but Cerny is clearly a very smart guy and a gamer himself, so I take him at his word. One additional feature of the PS5 CPU that I want to mention is called Smart Shift technology, which sends any unused computing power from the CPU to the GPU for increased graphical performance, which I think is on just about every gamer's wish list. Okay, let's now look at how the PS5 is changing not just what you see, but also what you hear. Unlike the PS4, the PS5 will have an entirely custom processing resource dedicated specifically to audio. It's called the Tempest engine, and it promises three-dimensional audio of a quality and complexity that we've never heard before, at least not in a video game. Cerny explained that the two major benefits of 3D audio are what he called presence and locality. Let's start with presence. This means that by playing sounds from literally hundreds of different sources or locations all around you, the PS5 can nearly fool your brain into thinking that you're there. Consider the sound of rain. Instead of playing the sound from an ambient track, the PlayStation 5 can simulate the sounds of individual raindrops falling at many different locations in front of you, behind you, to your left and right, and even above or below you. The second major benefit of 3D audio is locality, which Cerny described as the ability to tell exactly where a certain sound might be coming from within the game's world, again, even if it's above, below, or behind you. This has been possible to an extent on prior consoles, but not with the level of precision you'll get with PS5. As you might have guessed, 3D audio will be best perceived on a set of headphones or on a surround sound setup, but the effects are built into the hardware, meaning they don't require a peripheral. Sound will still have a 3D effect even if you're listening through your TV's built-in speakers. That said, you will have to be sitting in a particular sweet spot to hear the best results. And to help achieve these results, the PlayStation 5 will provide 5 unique hearing profiles that you can choose from, presumably during the console's setup process. PS5 games will then play sound based on that hearing profile. The result will be sound that's actually optimized for your ears. However, Sony did acknowledge that not all gamers will have hearing that matches one of these 5 profiles, so the results will vary based on the individual. He also said that in the future, Sony might be able to create specific profiles for each gamer. Granted, this might require you to send in photos or even videos of your ears. Until then, it will still be exciting to test out the PS5 with a nice set of headphones to see just how three-dimensional games can sound. The last major piece of hardware we haven't yet talked about is the DualSense controller. While the DualSense is taking a massive departure from the DualShock 4 in terms of looks, it also has a bunch of new features. First is the haptic feedback. Haptics, if you're not aware, provide physical feedback similar to rumble, but are much more precise and allow for many different sensations. For example, a driving game can simulate what it might feel like to hold a steering wheel as you drive through grass, mud, gravel, or over pavement, and each should feel distinct from one another. But Sony isn't the first to implement haptics into their controller. In fact, they're dead last. If you're curious how haptic feedback feels when playing a video game, try picking up a Nintendo Joy-Con or an Xbox One controller. Next are the adaptive triggers, which will apply different amounts of resistance depending on what you're doing in-game. As an example given by Sony, pulling back on a bow and arrow will provide gradually increased resistance. One feature of the DualSense that's not new, but rather updated, is the Share button, which will now be called the Create button. All Sony has said about the Create button is that it will allow players to, quote, create epic gameplay content to share with the world or just enjoy for themselves, end quote. My guess is that it will have all the features of the Share button, but it might also launch some sort of basic editing software so you can create custom clips to post online. Next up is the built-in microphone, which will allow you to chat with friends even without plugging in a headset. But Sony does warn that if you want to chat for extended periods, a headset is preferred. One of the most welcome changes to the DualSense is one that I mentioned earlier, and that's the USB-C port. Yep, the DualSense will charge via USB-C rather than micro USB, which proved unreliable to say the least on the PS4. And speaking of charging, one thing we don't know about and what I'm incredibly curious to learn is the battery life. The DualShock 4 had a very short battery life, and it would be nice if we didn't all have to plug in our controllers during longer play sessions. There will be an available charging station, but that won't work while playing a game, and I'm guessing it will be sold separately. Finally, there's the form factor of the controller itself. It does appear that the DualSense will be slightly larger than the DualShock 4, but Sony has said that they've put a lot of effort into making it, quote, feel smaller than it really looks, end quote. That they say this at all makes me skeptical, but the fact that it seems similar in shape to the Xbox One controller makes me confident that the DualSense will be comfortable. And as a very last detail, the light bar now surrounds the touchpad, making it much more visible than before. So that's the controller, but the PS5 will have a few other available peripherals, all of which have been designed or redesigned to match the PS5's aesthetic. There's the new PlayStation camera with dual 1080p lenses, a PlayStation branded headset, and a media remote. I'm not sure what the media remote will be able to control that the DualSense won't, but it's there, and I'm guessing this might actually be included with the PS5 because I just don't think many people would buy it otherwise. Okay, that's pretty much everything. But one last thing I want to talk about is whether you're gaming on a PS5, a PS4, or you're just watching videos like this on YouTube, you should do what you can to protect your data and your identity online. And that's why I want to share what is honestly an amazing offer from NordVPN. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if you're already using a VPN, but if you're not, connecting to a virtual private network is a simple way to protect yourself from hackers and online identity thieves. Whether you're shopping, banking, emailing, or playing a video game, NordVPN uses the same encryption as the US government and the NSA to help keep your data safe. What's more, NordVPN has been rated as one of the best VPNs for gaming by PC Gamer, Games Radar, and PC Mag. They even let you connect to servers in different countries, which lets you watch Netflix content that might only be available in those countries. Pretty cool. You can connect up to 6 devices at home or on the go, so you can protect your whole family, and when the world finally gets back to normal, you'll be safe at your favorite coffee shop, the airport, wherever. Best of all, right now NordVPN is offering my viewers 70% off their 3-year plan, plus you get 1 month free. That's 70% off, 1 month free, and you get 3 years of peace of mind. Just click the link in either the description or pinned comment of this video and use the coupon code QuestMode. Again, to get 70% off a 3-year plan plus 1 month free, just click the link below and use the coupon code QuestMode. That's QuestMode, all one word. And with that, I want to thank you for watching this entire video. If you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up, and if you didn't, give me a thumbs down. I do want to reiterate that there's a lot of information about the PlayStation 5, especially on the even more technical side of things, that I wasn't able to talk about here. If you want more information, I've left links to all my sources in the description below. And if I left anything out, let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about some of the games coming out for PS5, check out one of my ultimate previews on the screen now. Lastly, if you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you can find me on both at QuestMode Games. Until next time, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.